All right, thank you, everyone. Welcome. My name is Courtney Hobson. I'm Program Manager of the Drescher Center for the Humanities, and delighted to have you all join us this afternoon. Today's event is a part of our Fall 2024 Humanities Forum, a free public lecture series organized by the Drescher Center for the Humanities. I would like to share with you our next event, which will take place next week on Monday, November 4th, right here in the Library Gallery at 4 p.m. Adrian DeLeon, an assistant professor of history at New York University, will give a lecture entitled Diaspora's Boondocks, Hinterlands in Filipino American History. De Leon will reroute the history of Filipino American migration to its indigenous roots in the Bundock, which is Tagalog for the hinterland of northern Luzon, to the United States of America. So I hope that you guys can join us next week. And to learn more, I encourage you to go to the Drescher Center website, which is dreschercenter.umbc.edu. Before we begin, I'd like to make some announcements. First, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. While we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that truth-telling is only a small gesture, and we must take action towards the necessary work of repair. This afternoon's event is being recorded and will be made available on the UMBC YouTube page soon after. Additionally, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of English, as well as the Department of Africana Studies. And I'd also like to thank Charm City Books, who is our official bookseller tonight. We've partnered with Charm City Books this semester to be our official, unofficial bookseller. And I've actually partnered with them to create bookmarks, which are actually available on the table. I've curated a recommended reading list for each talk. It also includes a 10% off discount code for the books that are on the list. So we have one for this evening's talk, of course, all James Baldwin books. And then we also have a bookmark for next week's talk, which is books by or about folks of Filipino origin. So one more thing before we get to our formal introduction of our guest. Just want to inform you all that today's lecture is the Drescher Center's annual Daphne Harrison Lecture. This lecture was named after Professor Emerita Dr. Daphne Harrison, former chair of the Department of Africana Studies, as well as the founding director of the Humanities Scholars Program and UMBC's Center for the Humanities, which is now known as the James T. and Virginia M. Drescher Center for the Humanities. Daphne Harrison came to UMBC in 1972 as an associate professor of Africana Studies. In addition to her work as a teacher, during which she spearheaded a 2-year effort by UMBC and Baltimore school teachers to discuss racism in a serious way. She also acted as a founding director of UMBC's Center for the Humanities until her retirement in 1999. A scholar of music, she wrote a number of articles about the blues and published a path-breaking book entitled Black Pearls, Blues Queens of the 1920s. As a professor and faculty colleague, Harrison worked creatively with many departments and campus groups beyond her home department of Africana Studies, including what is now Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, the Music Department, the Meyerhoff Scholarship Program, and others. Once Harrison said, and I quote, "I love teaching and enjoy challenging students to be imaginative, to take risks, to stand up for what is right, regardless of peer pressure. As a result, I fell in love with every new group of students that walked into my classroom." As the first director of the Center for the Humanities, she worked tirelessly to mentor the undergraduate humanities scholars and to support humanities faculty across campus while inviting challenging and dynamic speakers to campus for Humanities Forum. We are grateful for her creative and foundational leadership, which we honor every year through this lecture. Now, Dr. Amy Freud, director of the Drescher Center, will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? It's delightful to welcome you and to welcome our guests who are here visiting UMBC. It's this special every day. So, my name is Amy Freud, and I'm a professor in the history department and the new director of the Drescher Center. I'm very pleased that our former director is here today, Dr. Jessica Berman. And it is a delight to welcome our Daphne Harrison lecturer this night, and I will get to that in just a moment. But I do want to thank our program manager, Courtney Hobson, for all of the work she has done to put together this wonderful event. So thank you, Courtney. The food, the bookmarks, the books, all kind of curating this wonderful event. So we are very excited to welcome tonight Dr. Dagmawi Woubshet, who is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Endowed Associate Term Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, just up the road. He is a scholar of literature and visual culture, and he works at the intersections of Africana and LGBTQIA plus studies. So actually very much somebody who people from multiple fields are reading. He is the author of The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS. His essays have appeared in multiple journals like Transition and NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and a little something called The Atlantic. Woubshet is the recipient of fellowships from, is it Chivitella Raneri, the Africa Institute in Sharjah, and the Modern Art Museum in Addis Ababa, where he curated Julie Meritu the Addis Show. And one of our colleagues here was aware of that show, Gannett, and talked about how it's still being talked about, evidently, in Ethiopia. So you really made a splash there. He's currently completing a book on James Baldwin's late style and is actually on sabbatical this semester to write, so I really appreciate that he came down here to visit us. Before joining the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, he taught at Cornell University, where he was named one of the 10 best professors at Cornell. I mean, that's nuts. He received his PhD in the history of American civilization from Harvard University, and before that, his BA in political science and history from Duke University. So we are fellow Dukies together. And it's been a lovely day getting to know him and his work, and now I get to share him with you. He will be speaking with us on James Baldwin and the art of late style.
Good evening, everyone. Mike, can you all hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for being here. I've received such an extraordinary hospitality since I've been here. First and foremost, I want to thank, I love it, my Amharic accent just came out. I said I want to thank. I want to thank Courtney Hobson just for curating everything. It's been just incredible. And also Professor Amy Freud for the wonderful introduction and welcome, and also Professor Jessica Berman for this invitation. And also I wish to thank Professor James Smalls, Dr. Freud, and Courtney took me to lunch at Mama Coco's, which is actually my spot in Baltimore since it opened. So I've had a lovely day. Let me also, to give a couple of shout outs, there's a show, I was just here a month ago at UMBC because one of my dearest friends had an opening just across, like in that direction. That's the conceptual artist and sculptor Levester Williams. He has a show right now, I think it's open till December, called All Matters Aside. So please, if you haven't seen it, check it out. And the other thing we all have to do, especially in these times, is support our local booksellers. Hello, Charm City. I just bought a book I just finished, but I'm going to gift this to actually Levester, who has a birthday coming up. So a little Ta-Nehisi love, but also love to an artist who has a show here. So all this to say, It's an incredible delight to be here. Okay, so I've been working on this book on James Baldwin for some time. I'm nearing the end, and I'm going to give you an abridged version of one of its chapters. And this, I chose to present on this chapter for some of you, if this is your first encounter with James Baldwin, it's to give you a good taste of, even though I'm focusing on Baldwin's late works, meaning from mid-70s to 1987, the work that doesn't get attention. I'm going to be comparing probably his most iconic book of essays, The Fire Next Time, and see the kind of revisions being had in the late 1980s. So hopefully you'll walk away with a sense of a classic Baldwin text, but also a text that has not received its due attention. All right. And then we'll have ample time, I hope, for Q&A. No American writer embodies the 1960s more so than James Baldwin. Not only did the decade cement his reputation as that rare artist, it saw also his rise as one of America's preeminent public intellectuals. Taking Baldwin's own literary timeline, we might say the 60s commenced for him in 1957, the year he left France and returned to the United States to report on the early days of the civil rights struggle in the South, and concluded, we might add, in 1972 with the publication of No Name in the Street, his elegiac meditation on the civil rights movement and the revolution that America underwent in a short span of time. And yet, Baldwin would continue to return to the 60s in his late works, using the advantage of hindsight to re-examine the significance of the era in its extended wake. As Raoul Peck's documentary film, I'm Not Your Negro, which came out in 2017, nominated for an Oscar, has recently brought to light, in 1979, Baldwin had begun to sketch a book called Remember This House, unfinished though it may be, a book he never completed, but intended to be a personal recollection of his friends, the assassinated civil rights leaders, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he appeared in 1982 in a beautiful film, it's available on YouTube, called I Heard It Through the Grapevine. We're going to start there. A documentary in which he retraces his initial journey from 1957 to the South, reflecting on that journey from a new historical horizon, the 1980s. In fact, at the very beginning of I Heard It Through the Grapevine, articulating the film's multiple time frames, this is what Baldwin says. This is how the film begins.
It was 1957. I left Paris for Little Rock. 1957. This is 1980. And how many years is that? Nearly a quarter of a century. And what has happened to all those people, children I knew then? And what happened to this country? And what does this mean for the world? What does this mean for me?
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So that frame, right? Someone from a different historical horizon trying to think about what happened in the 1960s, but also what it means for him. Yeah? So since Baldwin sought to make meaning of the 1960s in real time, as well as in retrospect, I find it instructive, even necessary, to take an expansive view of his ever-changing outlook on the era. One that looks beyond the confines of historical periodization based on decades, say 60 to 69, or the strict timetable of the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968. This shift in perspective is particularly important in understanding a writer like James Baldwin, so closely associated with the 1960s civil rights era movement, that association has come to define and too often delimit his work, because still remain understudied, underthought, the many books and essays he wrote from the mid-1970s until his death at the end of 1987. So one of the aims of this talk this evening is to read The Fire Next Time, a 60s classic, alongside an essay called To Crush a Serpent, Baldwin's last published essay and an exemplary piece of the author's late style. In To Crush a Serpent, Baldwin returns to a formative experience he'd written at length about in The Fire Next Time, his years as a teenage evangelist preacher, but this time he recasts that experience as a sexual coming-of-age story. As a queer sequel to the iconic civil rights era text that now includes the flesh and its reservoir of desires and fears, To Crush a Serpent significantly revises the definitive account of Baldwin's ministry in The Fire Next Time. I'll focus on their intertextual relationship between these two texts in the second half of the talk and elaborate why Baldwin waits until the end of his career to write explicitly about his own sexuality in the essay form. But first, I want to read The Fire Next Time on its own terms, paying careful heed of Baldwin's theory of love. To expound on love is also to expound on the most abiding theme and moral principle of Baldwin's work. And so the other aim this evening is to compare the uses of love in The Fire Next Time during the civil rights movement when black love assumes enormous political import in undoing American apartheid, and to see how love fares in the 1980s in To Crush a Serpent, where queer love takes on a powerful political force against the shadow of the AIDS crisis. Part one, it's a talk in two parts, love and liberation. The Fire Next Time, there's a copy over there, is arguably Baldwin's finest collection of essays, a lucid example of his ability to weave together aesthetics, politics, and ethics into one exquisite tapestry. Although it appeared in book form in 1963, its two missives were originally published the year before, the shorter piece, A Letter to My Nephew in the Progressive magazine, and the longer, nearly 40,000-word Letter from a Region of My Mind appeared in The New Yorker. Both exemplify Baldwin's signature essay form, which employs the author's personal story as text, as source for collective self-reflection. And here, the epistolary form, they're both written as letters. The epistolary form gives him ample room to shift points of view, sometimes in an instant, from the personal to the national to the global, from critical analysis of race, religion, and nation to existential meditations on why human beings need these categories in the very first place. Because the measure of the letter is perhaps not as prescribed as the essays to weigh specific subject matter, Baldwin can leap across a range of subjects while still sustaining the book's overall coherence. The epistolary form complements Fire Next Time in another way, too, since the set of feelings that often infuse Baldwin's essays, intimacy, vulnerability, righteous indignation, and yearning, become all the more acute for the reader, willing to be hailed as the epistle's direct addressee. Moreover, form and feeling cohere in Fire because the book's organizing principle is love. And the letter, perhaps, well, at least for my generation, and the letter, perhaps next to lyric, is the literary genre in which love finds its everyday expression. It might be a text now, right? Love is mentioned in over a dozen important passages in The Fire Next Time. But it's only in the last few pages that Baldwin presents us with what we can take to be a definition. Yeah? Love takes off the masks we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. I use the word love here, not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace, not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. This highly intricate, the Baldwin sentences, right? Intricacy of them. This highly intricate and suggestive definition resists easy summing up. Still, at the very least, we can glean from it that love is both an act and a condition. As an act, has the power of revelation, not divine or supernatural disclosure about human life coming from above, but human insight rooted in our worldly existence and experience, which holds the power to confront our deepest fears, as well as the power to extricate our private and public lives from a state of quagmire those fears trap us in. As a state of being, love stands opposed to a state of fear. Love is a state of grace, Baldwin adds, not in the Christian sense a condition free of sin, nor in the American ideal of the pursuit of happiness, but rather a constant universal striving that rests on human inquiry, courage, and maturity. In many ways, this definition is a distillation or abstraction of the other key claims on love that preceded, which posit love as a countervailing force against white power on the one hand and against Christianity on the other. Fire Next Time offers Baldwin's most trenchant critique of white power, revealing how white supremacy is contingent on black subjugation and how that asymmetry totally warps America, its people, its institutions, and its moral character. But as one example, consider how with characteristic economy, Baldwin describes this racial asymmetry in the New York of his youth. He says, quote, "It was absolutely clear that the police would whip you and take you in as long as they could get away with it, and that everyone else, housewives, taxi drivers, elevator boys, dishwashers, bartenders, lawyers, judges, doctors, grocers, would never, by the operation of any generous human feeling, cease to use you as an outlet for his frustration and hostilities. Neither civilized reason nor Christian love would cause any of those people to treat you as they presumably wanted to be treated," unquote. The law is not sole instrument of white power. If we follow Baldwin, that power, as he enumerates, also rests in the hands of fellow Americans across gender, across age, social rank, profession, whose very whiteness is the law that licenses them to harm and humiliate black people with impunity and with disregard to the political, civic, and religious virtues the nation ostensibly cherishes. To compound its power, moreover, whiteness relies on a structure of feeling that disavows the harm done in its name, a feeling that Baldwin brilliantly termed innocence. Perhaps Baldwin's most original insight in theorizing race is to identify innocence, white innocence, as a constitutive feature of white power. At one point he says, "It is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime," right? Which is to say, to author devastation entails one kind of force, a certain kind of force, right? To enslave, to come up with, apartheid laws, that's one kind of force. But Baldwin is saying here, is delineating here, it takes yet another kind to willfully ignore and deny the consequences of that kind of force. Right? So as a structure of feeling, innocence masks and voids America's violent racial past and present record, enabling white Americans not only to shirk responsibility, but to reify an idea of themselves and of America based on the Republic's noble ideals rather than its ignoble history. No substantive racial progress and no fundamental transformation of the self and the nation could be achieved so long as innocence remained the organizing feeling of American whiteness. We see how powerful that idea is, right? Today in this political election. Make America, what is it? Make America whatever again? Great again? Nostalgia, that's innocence, right? That's an incredible tagline. That's another, right, thing to talk about innocence. I actually said I'm going to limit the references to what's happening today. I can resist. But innocence traps white Americans in a false reality. It is the mask they must take off in order to reckon with themselves and their country. This is where love comes in when Baldwin is writing 1963, vis-a-vis whiteness, as a countervailing force, as Baldwin argues, in fact, the only remaining force powerful enough to free whiteness from its arrested state of fear, violence, and innocence. He says at one point, if love will not swing wide the gates, no other power will or can. In reading Fire, critics often jump to the book's penultimate sentence on the very last page to represent Baldwin's vision of love. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on and create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. Now, a vision of a vanguard of Americans made flesh in that simile of interracial lovers was certainly evocative and provocative in 1963, when de jure segregation and anti-miscegenation still reigned. But taking this image, this last, penultimate line, out of its textual context, without heeding closely the argument that Baldwin builds up to culminate in these final words, obscures the initial set of demands he places on the handful lot to reach a new level of consciousness they could then use to achieve America. And demands to each group, to white and black Americans, are qualitatively different. Early on in Fire, Baldwin writes, quote, white people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow, may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed, unquote. The function of love in this loaded statement is echoed in the definition I began with, but additionally, it resounds Baldwin's pointed claim of what love can do specifically for white people. He intertwines race and love here via a sentence that is both a chiasmus, an X, an inversion, that's both chiastic and conditional. He inverts the conventional paradigm that equates black people and the race problem, right? Like that's our default. When we talk about race, we're talking about people of color, right? That's how whiteness eludes the very discourse of race, right? So he equates, inverts the conventional paradigm that equates black people and the race problem, and instead figures white people as the problem of race. It also articulates the conditions under which this problem could be resolved. That is, if white people loved and accepted themselves and each other, confronted and rid themselves of an identity based solely on supremacist power and innocence, then there wouldn't be a need for a racial other against whom to measure and define self-worth. Now, love functions differently for the disenfranchised. The passages where Baldwin speaks of love in relation to black people emphasize love as an instrument of both intramural, intra-racial survival, and interracial transformation, right? In the first missive in The Fire Next Time, addressed to his nephew, notice Baldwin's propositions of both familial and intraracial black love, right? He says, for here you were, Big James, named for me. You were a big baby, I was not. Here you were, to be loved, baby, hard at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked bad that day too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet, but if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you and for the sake of your children and your children's children. In the first instant, right, love is a birthright. Think of it, how he puts it. For here you were, Big James' name for me, you were a big baby, I was not. Here you were, to be loved, writes Baldwin, creating with a colon a philosophical proposition that to be loved is the very purpose and prerogative of human existence, a natural right possessed by all. In this instance, this birthright, if we follow Baldwin's brilliant sentence, is embodied by both Jameses. The interlacing of the two names and the repetition of here you were, right, create an overlay we are meant to notice and ask about. Does the you refer to Big James, or to his namesake, or to both? We wonder, passing as we do through the same construction, here you were twice. Baldwin himself, if you will, kind of haunts the sentence with his own possibility, conceiving himself and his nephew within a larger proposition on being. Existence is a matter of space and time. Here, location, were, time, Baldwin reminds us, and also a matter of love. To be equals love, right? If we follow the intricacy of this sentence. In this passage, furthermore, he tells his nephew that love also fortifies, especially a people stripped of the rights of humanity and citizenship, becoming a vehicle of surviving a death-dealing world. That's a line actually from Frederick Douglass, Maryland, right? He says, slavery and its death-dealing world for ensuring futurity. Black love, it turns out, as Baldwin argues, is also key to realizing a just, interracial, multiracial America. Addressing his nephew in the first example as and a black collective in the second, he writes, "Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies beyond the words acceptance and integration. There's no reason for you to try to become like white people. And there's no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope." And then he continues, "And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it." Again, in both instances, Baldwin positions black love to be essential, right? Integration, transformation of the nation. The same rhetorical performance we saw above with the Negro problem applies here, whereby Baldwin attacks and inverts the racial assumption of American keywords, like integration, which in 1963 widely meant the acceptance of black people by white people, institutions, and standards, right? He flips that. He overturns this assumption, again with an italicized chiasmus. This is a rhetorical figure that we see in Baldwin again and again. That's why I'm harping on it. And repurposes the word integration to signify black acceptance of white people and, by extension, the transformation of American institutions and standards on black terms. Writing on the eve of the end of legal apartheid, right, because this is published in 1963, then this is what Baldwin demands of black people, not only to accept whites, but to do it with love. The prepositional construction in both examples indicating black love as a vital instrument for white liberation and interracial national renewal. In Fire, Baldwin is concerned with demystifying and debunking power wherever that power resides. The unprecedented price demanded at this embattled hour of world history is the transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars, Baldwin says. And indeed, his searing critique of white power is matched by his fierce confrontation with Christianity. In the second epistle, that Baldwin offers a moving account of his days in the church. What led him there in the first place, what propelled him to become an adolescent preacher, and eventually what brought him down from the pulpit and forced him out of the temple. I'll say more about this story a bit, but for now it's worth recalling why Baldwin gives up God and with what power he replaces him. Baldwin rejects Christianity on the one hand because of its collusion with white supremacy, a collusion that has left the American church morally bankrupt. On the other hand, as a teenage preacher, so Baldwin was a very famous teenage evangelist from 14 to 17 in Harlem. Right? Also, as a teenage preacher, Baldwin had witnessed how the church functioned, like many an American institution, also for personal gain rather than the collective good, for instilling fear and safety rather than fellowship and daring. He had seen firsthand the disconnect between a preacher's public sermon and his private conduct, including his own, all of which reasons that led him to question and ultimately abandon the church. When describing his personal experience in the church, as well as the general principles of Christianity in America, Baldwin's tone is acerbic, even indignant. He characterizes his early calling not as a vocation, but a career and a gimmick. Right? He says, it was my career in the church that turned out precisely to be my gimmick. Right? The church not as a holy institution, but a dishonest scheme. He says, I found myself in the church racket. And his role not as a minister of religion, but an actor or a magician. Being in a pulpit was like being in a theater. What a line. I was behind the scenes and knew how the illusion was worked. Right? Moreover, of the principles of both black and white churches, he writes, I was able to see that the principles governing the rights and customs of the churches in which I grew up did not differ from the principles governing the rights and the customs of other churches, white. The principles were blindness, loneliness, and terror. The first principle necessarily and actively cultivated in order to deny the other two. I would love to believe that the principles were faith, hope, and charity, but these clearly not so for most Christians or for what we call the Christian world. Right? And as his ultimate statement on religion, he closes out the first section of Down at the Cross, the second essay, which focuses on his ministry with these emphatic words. It is not too much to say that whoever wishes to become a truly moral human being, and let us not ask whether or not this is possible, I think we must believe that it is possible, must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time we got rid of him. I should maybe move. I don't want, lightning to strike me. Okay. Now, Baldwin's rejection of Christianity at root is not unlike his rejection of white power. In both cases, he's challenging doctrines that he reasons limit human freedom and possibility and thwart love's intrinsic values and virtues, while in the absence of his Christian faith, the authority he summons in the fire next time for its ethical and political resources, for its edifying power, is love. To be sure, while Baldwin gives up Christian foundationalism, he never abandons the cultural and spiritual raw materials of the church. How fitting that the essay in which he rejects God and Christianity is titled Down at the Cross, and the book itself, The Fire Next Time, right? Both references obviously drawn from the Bible. It would be inconceivable to imagine the corpus of James Baldwin emptied out of the language, the music, the pathos of the black church. If that were to happen, we wouldn't have his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, nor his last, Just Above My Head, both, right, traditional, both spirituals, gospel songs, nor his play, The Amen Corner, right, and Blues from Mr. Charlie, to name but a handful of texts. But using the resources of the black church and the parables and metaphors of Christianity for artistic purposes, or to forge a secular worldview, is not the same as keeping Christian faith. His writings do not bear out the latter, whereas they cannot exist without the former. Surely one of Baldwin's achievements as an artist is to blur, even erase, the division between the sacred and the profane. Conventions tell us that the sacred is tethered to the divine and the profane to the worldly. Sacred words, rites, and spaces, say holy, prayer, places of worship, are bound up with a higher spiritual power. We show total reverence and devotion, whereas the profane is outside the purview of religion and deals with human affairs that are earthbound, temporal, and often of the flesh. But in Baldwin's hands, this sacred-profane binary comes undone as he rewrites religious idiom to describe worldly experiences that range from inner sexual turmoil to external social and political crisis. Now, I've been reading Love, if you will, textually, right? Just paying close attention to his language, heeding his language carefully, how he defines and delineates it, and how he fashions rhetoric to work out the relationship among love, race, and religion. I'd be remiss, however, not to point out the ideological and political implications of Baldwin's enterprise. American civilization is founded on the assumption, because we were deemed subhuman, black people were incapable of love. American slavery buttressed and was buttressed by Enlightenment discourse that inscribed an intrinsic fixed difference between white and black people, reasoned that black people were an inferior class who lacked the physical form and the mental and emotional faculties that distinguish the human from the non-human animal. A paragon of his age, Thomas Jefferson wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that embody, color, figure, hair, mind, the ability to reason, compose, narrate, and emotion, the ability to grieve and to love. Black people were deficient, subordinate, and substandard to whites. I have a long Jefferson quote, but for time's sake, I think we're going to skip him. In effect, right, he's making this case. He's talking about our first poet in the tradition, Phyllis Wheatley. He says, oh, she could recite religious catechism, but she's not a true poet because she doesn't have the natural faculties of emotion like love and grief. Right? So in that text, he's actually using Enlightenment discourse to talk about emotional faculty, in this case, love. Right? Okay. Right, so yes, since she is black, Wheatley lacks the requisite feelings to be a proper poet, indeed to produce art, which is the prerogative of human being who loves, and not, he says, a black who cannot. Right? So it turns out that love, and this is something, there are more examples of how Enlightenment discourses actually, because we talk about all the ridiculous stuff that's been made about the black body, but about emotion and love being used as a reason, right, to differentiate the races. It turns out that love is among the categories that Jefferson uses to rationalize black people's ostensible ontological difference and inferiority. He adds, love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation, right? Employing again the black body, white mind schism that underwrites the Enlightenment. In fact, here Jefferson suggests that with a graded quantifier more, that by comparison, black love is not love per se, but simply the expression of physical, sexual desire, devoid of love's other features, like tenderness, exquisiteness, sentience. It's within this warped world that rendered black love a contradiction in terms and relied on love as a category to reify white supremacy that black love assumes a radical ideological power. Since in constituting the United States and modernity's master discourse, emotional faculty was also a category manipulated for measuring and establishing racial hierarchy, we have to interrogate not just the grand claims about the black physical mental difference, but also about black feelings. Baldwin understood this very well. Part of the achievement of the Fire Next Time is its overturning of a paradigm of race built on the belief that black people were inherently unequipped to exercise love's full prerogatives. Why chiasmus becomes the key rhetorical and political device in Fire, enabling Baldwin to overturn within a single sentence, right, America's racial equation. In the same way, to come back to Douglas, who used that chiasmus so powerfully in his narrative, right, uses the trope to topple the discourse of racial hierarchy in his own time. Okay. Now, it is true Baldwin may not be writing during the era of chattel slavery, and that famous chiasmus from Douglas is, you have seen how a man is made a slave, now you shall see how a slave is made a man, right? But this rhetorical device, you see it in Zora Neale Hurston, you see it in so many writers. A noted critic like Henry Louis Gates Jr. actually talks about this as one of the master tropes in the African American literary tradition, because it's a rhetoric of inversion. Okay. Baldwin may not be writing during the era of chattel slavery. Still, he's writing at a time when black people remain legally disenfranchised. Black people may not have been enslaved in 1963, but still remained in the grips of the slavery's afterlife, a point Baldwin intimates at the outset of Fire by retitling the first essay, My Dungeon Shook, a letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation. And needless to say, Baldwin is also writing amid a mass movement determined to overturn American apartheid, and also a political movement that used love as an extraordinary indispensable political instrument, right? In fact, black love is political, a fact that the civil rights movement definitively established. Lest we forget the awesome mass movement that Dr. King and his comrades led, and the nonviolent resistance that they championed and deployed to extraordinary effect was anchored in love. Constitutive and nonviolent militant action, right, is agape love, a point that Dr. King articulated in countless religious sermons, political speeches, philosophical essays, and indeed in practice. Distinct from eros, sexual love or desire, philia, friendship, affection, agape, selfless love, and Christian theology is embodied in Christ and the love covenant between God and humankind. I'm going to skip this too because, yes, it's a quote that I have from a very early essay from Dr. King when he's talking about agape love and anchoring the movement in love. But I think for this audience, this may be an obvious point. So this is what I'm trying to say. There is a binding kinship at this time between King's and Baldwin philosophies in that both endow love with transformative redemptive power, in fact, as the power that could alter the course of American history and moral character, and both recognize the capacity of black people to unleash love in a way that could counter the forces of white supremacy and regenerate the nation. But a fundamental difference. King's idea of love rests on a religious transcendental order, existence of God and of God's love, while Baldwin's, however inviolable, is rooted in human existence and experience. You might say this is where the preacher and the ex-preacher part ways. King's love is authorized by God, whereas Baldwin is licensed by the best in us fellow flawed human beings. Still religious or secular, however distinct their worldview, both championed love as the lever that could lift the country out of its racial and moral quagmire, as well as the firm ground upon which a new America could be built. So one cannot understand power like white supremacy without its emotional drive, its innocence, for example, which Baldwin considered to be a powerful inimical structure of feeling to be distinguished from other instruments of power. In any political system, there's always collusion between formal politics and sentiment, between political institutions and the feelings that guide and govern them. So when Baldwin speaks of political matters in ostensibly non-political terms, it is to expose how the political and the emotional, spiritual are deeply intertwined. He says, at one point, it could be objected that I'm speaking of political freedom in spiritual terms, but the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation, unquote. And since architects of this country chose love as one of the categories with which to design white supremacy, then it's wise for us to consider love's dangerous, damaging application in the founding of this republic, as well as love's insurrectionary role during the civil rights movement. Okay, I'm going to cruise through this. Now part 2. So fine, next time, love. Okay, love is where you find it, is the title of the next section, but I think I should. Okay, leap with me to 1987. We were in 1963, right? Leap with me to 1987, to the publication of To Crush a Serpent, the very year that Baldwin died. It's the very last piece that he published, right? Originally published in Playboy magazine in January 1987, and anthologized in The Cross of Redemption, Uncollected Writings in 2010, this short essay is a gem piece illustrative of Baldwin's late style, a distinguishing feature of which is the unflinching characterization of the author's sexuality. Thematically, a signal difference between Baldwin's novels and his essays is that while the question of queer sexuality is central to his fiction, it's negligible in his essays. Only 2 book reviews, The Preservation of Innocence from 1949, The Male Prison from 1951, talk about sexuality, but not in the kind of characteristic Baldwin personal essay, right? They're more like expository essays and book reviews. And when he broaches his own sexuality in the 1972 book, No Name in the Street, it's in a very fraught, contorted passage and a very distressing one in his reply to Eldridge Cleaver's homophobic attacks against him. Right? So it's only in the last two essays, Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, published in 1985, and To Crush a Serpent in 1987, both published in Playboy magazine, that Baldwin uses his signature genre to explore his sexual coming of age, revealing the close imbrication of sexuality, race, and religion in American life. Now, why does Baldwin wait until the end of his career to implot, to narrate, perform his sexuality in the essay form? Not a negligible fact for a writer who redefined the personal essay. Right? Why revise a steadfast position, one that he maintained in many interviews, that his sexuality was a private matter, not a public subject? Right? For instance, when asked about it in a 1970, very short, 10-minute lyrical documentary, Sedat Peker's lyrical short film, shot in Turkey, called James Baldwin from Another Place, he responds visibly annoyed. He says, I don't really know how to answer that question. In the first place, I don't exactly resent it, but I don't feel it's somebody's business whatever goes on in anybody's bedroom. But in my own case, I can see that it's a very big issue for a lot of people. I don't know. I have a certain Puritan thing about two things: a certain kind of privacy, which is everybody's right, certainly mine, and a certain kind of pride, unquote. So how do we explain then, this is early 70s, this deliberate self-breach of privacy and pride in the late essays? Does it matter that Baldwin had withdrawn from the kind of intense public life that he led in the 1960s and was no longer beholden to the role of the race man, which was thrust upon him and which he embraced during the Civil Rights era? How about the rise of black women authors and the renaissance of black gay art in the 1980s and the overall cultural ferment in the 1980s? To think together, right, as black feminists have taught us, questions of race, of gender, of class, sexuality, right, together. Did that have a bearing on Baldwin's late works? Since a defining feature of the Baldwin essay is the way it leverages the author's personal experience as text for collective reflection, this pivotal shift towards sexuality in the late essays is noteworthy and merits our attention. So these are questions in mind. I'm going to move through Crush a Serpent, a late sequel to The Fire Next Time. Both essays relay the story of Baldwin's adolescent years in the ministry, a bond reflected in the opening lines of both missives, right? He says, I won't read everything. I underwent, during the summer that I became 14, a prolonged religious crisis. I use the word religious in the common and arbitrary sense, meaning that I then discovered God, and he goes on. This is in The Fire Next Time. So you could appreciate the narrative slant. I was a young evangelist preaching in Harlem and other black communities for about 3 years. Young means adolescent. I was 14 when I entered the pulpit and 17 when I left. Those were very crucial years, full of wonder. And one of the things I most wondered about was the fellowship of Christianity. So similar narrative slant, but then we get a very different rehearsal of his time in the ministry. These initial words set the narrative slant for both essays as explorations of the collision of adolescence of faith in the author's life, and we anticipate the collusion of race and religion in American Christianity. But while Fire Next Time goes on to cast this collision and collusion as a religious and racial coming-of-age story, To Crush a Serpent recast it also as one of sexual awakening, focusing on the feelings of an adolescent boy coming to physical and sexual maturity. At the same time, he was a minister of the faith. We might say, Fire Next Time reckons with the young Baldwin's fear of the evil without, but says very little about the evil within. That was also the source of his adolescent fear. That is, the internal turmoil that fed his prolonged religious crisis is barely discussed, not even mentioned in Fire Next Time, whereas it's fully fleshed out in To Crush a Serpent. Early in The Crush a Serpent, Baldwin frames the essay with a key redefinition of adolescence, right? Again, I'm going to skip this, y'all, just so I see because of time. So all this to say, it's about Well, no, actually, I can't skip this one. Adolescence is why people, I'll be quick, in this country appear to be beginning to remember, in somewhat vindictive ways, as the most tranquil passage in everybody's life. It is a virgin time, the virgin time, the beginning of the confirmation of oneself as other. Until adolescence, one is a boy or a girl, but adolescence means that one is becoming male or female, a far more devastating and impenetrable prospect. This is how we talk about gender matters now, right? Until adolescence, one's body is simply there like one's shadow or the weather. With adolescence, this body becomes a malevolently unpredictable enemy. It also becomes, for the first time, appallingly visible. Everybody sees it. You see it, though you've never taken any real notice of it before. You begin to hear it. It begins to sprout odors like airy, invisible mushrooms. But this is not the worst. Other people also see it and hear it and smell it. You can scarcely guess what they see and hear and smell, can guess it dimly, only from the way they appear to respond to you. I mean, just poetry, my God. Such a compression of language and ideas in these prose. Baldwin's definition, right? Clearing gesture, right? He says it's the virgin time, which Baldwin characterized as the time of both innocence and profound rupture, a different kind of innocence here. A rupture that is cognitive, right? Which is the confirmation of oneself as other, social, becoming male or female, and physical, right? This body becomes a malevolently unpredictable enemy. So notice Baldwin's use of the word virgin as an adjective to modify time that is in radical flux, not as a noun to mark a static state of being. A choice word also in the context of defining adolescence because its proxies like innocence, purity, naivety, its sphere of activity is the flesh, right? When we talk about the virgin. Notice, too, the economy with which he captures the cognitive, social, physical dissonance of adolescence. To begin to see oneself as other is a rupture from how one had previously introjected the external world. Also a reflection of one's conscription into a world fastidious about enforcing social categories. The word other is double-edged, of course, descriptive and prescriptive here. Moreover, I'm skipping things. And the shift from boy to female and boy to male and girl to female indexes not merely physical change, but the hardening of prescribed gender roles, right? As Baldwin stresses, a far more devastating and impenetrable prospect. Then the body, also witnessing a metamorphosis, becoming to itself and others visible, audible, redolent, physically and sexually woke. Baldwin is right. Going through these extraordinary changes is not the most tranquil passage in anybody's life. Now, having to reconcile one's inner sexual awakening with the rigid expectation of the outside world is hard enough for any adolescent, let alone a teen preacher. After outlining the general parameters of adolescence, Baldwin fills in the details of how the onset of these changes fueled his evangelism. Right? He says, it's not the best moment to be standing in the pulpit. Though having said that, I must, to be honest, add that my ministry almost certainly helped me through my adolescence by giving me something larger than myself to be frightened about. And it preserved, as it were, an innocence that in retrospect protected me. For though I had been formed by sufficiently dire circumstances and moved in severely circumscribed world, I was also just another curious, raunchy kid. I was able to see later, watching other kids, like the kid I had been, that this combination of innocence and eagerness can be a powerful aphrodisiac to adults and is perhaps the key to the young minister's force, or more probably, only one of many keys. Certainly the depth of his belief is a mighty force. And when I was in the pulpit, I believed. The personal anguish counts for something, too. It was the personal anguish that made me believe that I believed. People do not know on what this anguish feeds, but they sense the anguish and they respond to it. What's striking here is revelation of how desire mediated his personal faith, as well as his relationship with his congregation. On the one hand, his ministry helped ease the terrors of adolescence, since there was other worldly terrors to preoccupy the young believer and preacher. Right? When I was in the pulpit, I believed, says Baldwin, a belief deeply shaped by a hermeneutics of biblical literalism, right, that Pentecostalism espouses. We can suppose for Baldwin the evangelist, hell's eternal fire was not a metaphor, but a literal, inextinguishable blaze that awaited the wicked, unrepentant soul. And the awe and reverence with which he held God was equally matched by the fear of his wrath. Now imagine the vision of apocalypse can strike terror even in the adult skeptic and non-believer, to say nothing of the young who cling to faith blindly. The end times is near and proximate. A doctrine so prized in evangelical Christianity is a real and terrifying prospect. And for the adolescent evangelical preacher, I'd imagine easier to mortify the flesh to gain salvation than be concupiscent and face damnation. We glean from these passages that as a believer, the combination of adolescent and religious innocence informed Baldwin's blind faith, while on the other hand, as a preacher, the combination of innocence and eagerness imbued the rapport with his flock. After all, says Baldwin, however sanctified, he says, I was just another curious, raunchy kid, and it was this confluence of sexual chastity, keen carnal appetite that the young possess, and that adults covet in the young, a powerful aphrodisiac, he says, which helped charge his ministry. I'm almost towards the end. He says, I was in love with my friend, as boys indeed can be at that age, but hadn't the faintest notion what to do about it. Not even in my imagination, which may suggest that the imagination's kicked off by memory. Or perhaps I simply refuse to allow my imagination to wander, as it were, below the belt. Judging from my experience, I think that all of the kids in that church were like that, which is certainly why a couple of us went mad. Others simply backslid, went back into the world. One relentless and realistic matron, a widow, determined to keep her 18-year-old athlete in the flock, in the pulpit, and in his right mind, took him south, found him a bride, brought the son and the girl, who scarcely knew each other, back home. The entire operation could have taken no more than a week. We went to see the groom one morning, and as we left, my friend yelled, "Don't do anything we wouldn't do." The groom responded with a lewd grin, "Y'all better not be doing what I'm doing," which suggests that we endured our repression with a certain good humor, at least for a time. Right? I'm just going to feature the quotes. And then he goes on. My sexuality was on hold, for both women and men had tried to mess with me in the summer of my 14th year and had frightened me so badly that I found the Lord. The salvation I was preaching to others was fueled by the hope of my own. I left the pulpit upon the realization that my salvation could not be achieved that way. But it is worth stating this proposition in somewhat harsher terms. Unmanageable distress had driven me to the altar, and once I was there, at least for a while, cleansed. But at the same time, nothing had been obliterated. I was still a boy in trouble with himself and the streets around him. Salvation did not make time stand still or rest the changes occurring in my body and my mind. Salvation did not change the fact that I was an eager sexual potential in flight from the inevitable touch. And I knew that I was in flight, though I could not then, to save my soul, have told you what I was fleeing. Right? These are a remarkable set of paragraphs, for they make clear, for the first time in Baldwin's writing, what compelled him to devote his life to God was a deep sense of fear that accompanied his sexual coming of age. A fear prompted by the experience of being a sexual target, as well as the recognition of oneself as a sexual subject. And also a fear compounded by Christian belief, warning the high price to be paid for the sins of the flesh. Baldwin sought refuge from this fear in his ministry, and however temporary, found relief there. And the salvation he sought and preached were intimately connected to this collision between faith and desire. For a time, his sins were cleansed, but his fears remained. And it's the recognition of this contradiction, that matters of the flesh cannot be resolved in evangelical terms, which prompts Baldwin to leave the pulpit. It's important to recall the particular reason. Give me 5 minutes, I'll be done, because I want us to have, he says, this is what he says in the very next time. He says, I dated the slow crumbling of my faith, the pulverization of my fortress, from the time about a year I had begun to preach, when I began to read again. I justified this desire by the fact that I was still in school, and I began fatally with Dostoevsky. Now, what is the story we get into Crush the Serpent? He says, so in time, a heavy weight fell on my heart. I did not want to become a liar. I did not want my love to become manipulation. I did not want my fear of my own desires to transform itself into power precisely over those who feared and were therefore at the mercy of their own desires. In my experience, the minister and his flock mirror each other. It demands a very rare, intrepid, genuinely free and loving shepherd to challenge the habits and fears and assumptions of his flock and help them enter the freedom that enables us to move to higher ground. I was not that shepherd, and rather than betray the ministry, I left it. Wow. Right, reading, we know, is our gateway to the largeness and complexity of the world, and I'm sure it helped ungate the young Baldwin's worldview, right? But his apostasy, as we see, entailed more than simply reading Dostoevsky. It required a personal confrontation with the fear of his own desires, a fear he did not want to exploit in the service of his teaching, nor in serving his congregation, right? Let me just, I have a whole thing about the kind of, I suggested this, maybe this can come out in the Q&A, of the context, why the 1980s, right? Like, it's not, I'll just say this and then, I'll close out there. For instance, both of these essays in which he's talking about his own sexual coming of age appear in Playboy magazine. The editors are asking him, in Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, those of you who grew up in the 1980s, think of all our great, like, superstars were androgynous. Prince, Michael Jackson, you name it. What's that? Grace Jones, right? Boy George. Oh my God, no, I'm referring to him as David Bowie. I was going to say Iman's husband. Yes, David Bowie. David Bowie, right? So they're asking him, Mr. Baldwin, explain what's happening with all this androgyny and gender fuck, right? In a way, in a different context, in the 1960s, James Baldwin is being asked to come and appear as a public intellectual only to talk about race matters. In a different context, and also 1980s is a time where queer sexuality enters our public discourse with full force given the mass devastation and calamity that was the AIDS crisis and the AIDS epidemic, right? So there's a way in which queer writers and activists changed the public discourse and talked about queer sexuality openly because it was a matter of life and death, right? So the cultural context of the 1980s had changed. Moreover, Baldwin's key interlocutors, remember, in the 1950s in all these debates, he's being compared to Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright as who is the representative Negro writer. By 1980s, the standard bearers of African-American literature are black women. Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, right? And Baldwin's also key interlocutors, Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni, the critic Eleanor Traylor, Toni Morrison, who's one of his besties. So it changes even the way in which black women begin to appear in Baldwin's fiction, right? So I had a little bit about how the context has changed that enabled him also to talk about his sexuality in the essay form, which was the genre in which he kind of appears as a public intellectual, right? So a bit of improvisation. I had some good sentences at the end, but for time's sake, I'll stop there and open it up to Q&A. Sorry, I went over. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Would you like me to help with questions?
Sure.
Or do you want to go?
I can do it. Raise it. Okay.
Oh, God, I have to use a microphone? I don't want to use a microphone because it's like a half-formed thought. I was just thinking about some of the key ideas from the first portion of your talk and trying to make a connection to the second portion of your talk, like love, innocence, whatever.
Sure.
And I was just thinking about the weaponization of innocence that you were talking about in the first half, and that's what I remember of the 80s, because the AIDS crisis had people talking about AIDS as like a punishment,
Yeah.
and like not having AIDS meant you were innocent somehow. That's like a a teenager memory of that time. So I don't know if you've kind of thought about the way those ideas are carrying through.
So in the second half, I am talking about how actually queer love assumes a different kind of political import. And in this essay, To Crush a Serpent, he's also, this is, as we know, 1980s is also a time when the religious right and Republican politics conjoin and become a force to be reckoned with. So in this essay, he's actually addressing Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. And what he's doing is he's speaking with the authority of an ex-minister of the faith. So the way he actually exits this essay, it is probably his most religious. There are about 4 paragraphs on what salvation means, and using a kind of humanist term, right? But he is, in this instance, leveraging the fact that one of our, he's been writing about queer sex early as 1955, Giovanni's Room, right? A writer who's got that kind of insight, a queer man, a personal insight, and an ex-minister of faith to talk about Falwell, who said, oh, this is God's retribution on homosexuals, right? I mean, that was the discourse. Thank God AIDS came because it's going to get rid of, right? And I live in Pennsylvania. You all are in Maryland. You might not be seeing these ads every day now. Especially in the last 2 weeks, it's all the transphobia. It's all transphobia that I see in a swing state like Pennsylvania, right? So to me, it's like it's redux of the 1980s, the way in which queer people were being used as political football, and we see a similar kind of dynamic with trans folks now, like how you exploit the most vulnerable in your society, in your whatever, political game or calculus, right? But I love that the ex-minister I have insight on Christianity too. Let me tell you, Pat Robertson, right, or Jerry Falwell.
Anyone else? I was waiting.
So I love this. I don't know this late essay, but I'm going to have to read this late essay. I'm really interested in this question of the material that appears in the fiction does not appear in the personal essays. And because I mostly teach the fiction, so that's where I live most of the time. Sorry. I wonder if you had a slide like this and you had "Go Tell It on the Mountain," a quote, about this same time period, about the question of preaching or the moment of faith, how you would think about is there such a bright line that divides the fiction from the personal essay, or is there a way in which he's threading ideas that he worked through in the fiction that come out later again in other essays? Or just wonder how you could weave in the fiction into this story of transformation over his life.
Thank you. That's a great question. So just the way the book is divided, it's really on kind of genre-based, right? So I have a take on the Baldwin essay, so late essays, what they're doing. I have a thing on Just Above My Head, his last novel. It's long, I think that's why we don't read it, but to me it's his most accomplished novel, and what he's trying to do with song in that, like, new rhetorically, with lyric, with gospel songs. And then this stuff we don't even read. So I have a thing, one of the claims of the book is everybody, because there's a declension, a narrative decline, that we still contend with. Hilton Als, he is one of the most astute, critic in New York, astute readers of early Baldwin. He still says after 1968, it's the fashion of mind. Baldwin kind of lost his aesthetic, the things that distinguished his art. Part of it is people expect him to work in these two genres, right? Of the novel, we want the same novel, or the essay. And Baldwin is much more experimental. So children's book, Little Man, is an exquisite book. Poetry, Jimmy's Blues, it's over there, right? So there's a way, I'm trying to argue, minor forms become a major feature of late style, right? And it's much more like experimental work. So that's one of the claims. But still, to your question, I do think in the fiction, even Go Tell It on the Mountain, all the homosocial bond between John and Elijah, I mean, it's there. Like the holy kiss, right? The intimacy on the threshing floor. But then with his second book, 1955, when Giovanni's Room came out, it was censored. He couldn't publish it in this country at first, right? Because it clearly, homosexuality is at the center of, it's a thing, right? You can't skirt around it, right? And Baldwin says, actually in one interview when he's asked why you wrote, he says, well, you couldn't entrap me. Like I told you about myself by writing a book, right? I mean, and also defying all kinds of expectation. There are no black characters, or there's a minor black character, but it's about white characters, a white expatriate in France, not able to reckon with his sexuality. So one, you're a black writer, you should be writing the expectation in 1955, you should write about black people. He says no to that. And also you're writing explicitly about queer stuff. I think the personal essay, because by really the late 50s and early 60s, right, the first black author to grace the cover of Time magazine, the essay is a thing in which he's speaking to the public, like that kind of, and I think he puts on a kind of the trappings of the race man. I do. And I skipped this, the way in which all the homophobia surrounding, from former president like JFK used to refer to him as Martin Luther Queen, to black radicals. I had a quote from Eldridge Cleaver, and there's a point where the critic Henry Louis Gates says, by 1970, Baldwin bashing had become a sport, right? Like if you're a black writer, of a different generation, he's too co-opted, he's too et cetera, et cetera. So I can't imagine the anguish, like someone using your sexuality to tarnish your reputation and discredit your genius, right? So he moves to the south of France and buys a house in 1970, and that's where he spends the last 17 years. And he's not tasked to appear on Meet the Press, the Dick Cavett show, whatever that he was doing, in the kind of public schedule that he had in the 1960s, in the same way in the late 70s, 80s, right? He's no longer the public intellectual of note you would call to appear in the south of France, right? So I think that gives him a different kind of, I don't know, just room to maneuver. But you're right, it's hard for any writer, especially like Baldwin, to somehow disarticulate the genres. It's just the way the architecture of the book I'm working on is genre, because I'm trying to make a claim of these changes that happen in these different genres. Thank you.
All right, for the sake of time, we're going to end there, but there's time for conversation afterwards. And also, please buy books.
Yes.
Buy books. Everyone, please give a round of applause to Dagmawi Woubshet.
Thank you, y'all. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for coming. Thank you.